Hello, and welcome to the Kathleen Spracklin podcast. I am a woman on a mission to gather a cadre of writers, thinkers, and teachers who are transforming the world one character at a time. And it all starts with one thing: a deep understanding of human motivation, why people do what they do, and the forces that drive them. To gain that understanding, I am mining the intersection of psychology, philosophy, and theology to make you a better writer. This is episode 107, Syntopical Reading into a Zettelkasten, Anchor Cards. Okay, yesterday we got down to the serious business of taking an anchor book and making some main cards out of the anchor book. We're using syntopical reading, using a combination of the advice of Mortimer Adler in How to Read About Book, in Sartalange's The Intellectual Life, and in Umberto Eco's book, How to Write a Thesis. And so we have the mechanism that we're going to be using is an anchor book, which we're going to read intensively, analytically, to use Mortimer Adler's terms. And then we're going to be reading a couple of additional books into the same set of cards that we're creating from the anchor book. And because we're using a Zettelkasten to gather our information, we have the ability to read these books sequentially. We don't have to read them simultaneously, as is the usual pattern with syntopical reading. But we are also going to draw from Adler's advice, which is to do an inspectional reading to set the structure. And that turns out to be extremely important for us with the Zettelkasten because we're going to use the structure to set our cards. Now, the book that I chose is my book, Writing with Emotion. I guess I'm a little bit prejudiced, but it has some serious advantages. It's in my field. It's not very long. It's 70 pages. It's very well organized because I am at heart a systems person. I come from a computer programming background, math, computer science background, and statistics and organization is just my thing. So because it is very organized and it's very much a synopsis, it serves as a good guinea pig. So I'm not standing here in front of you and saying that it's, if we were to examine all of the potential sources out there, that this would be the one we would choose. I am saying that it's a very convenient choice. And many of you have this book. Many of you who are watching this have ordered the book. It's available at kathleenspracklin.com/book. You can also find that in the comments. So yesterday we began with creating our cards, and we used the structure that we saw in the book to start creating the cards. Now what I'm going to have you look at today while we're revisiting cards is that yesterday we did not include the personal reflection. Every main card in a Zettelkasten needs to have a piece of you. If it doesn't have a piece of you, it's just a raw data fact. It's going to escape you in no time flat. In fact, I've covered in other broadcasts, there's research solidly that shows that if it's related to you, you're going to remember it much, much better. And this is how to make sure it's related to you. Plus, it does another very important thing that Mortimer Adler suggests, which is by putting things in your own words, that's when you find out whether you really understood what you read. And if you can't say anything relevant, then maybe you didn't understand. So a couple of very good reasons there. And the other thing that we didn't take the time to do yesterday was to track down the reference. In this case, using my system for abbreviation, it's R.KS, Kathleen Spracklin, WE, Writing with Emotion, the keywords in the title. Author's initials in the author's name, underscore, keywords in the title. That is almost never going to be duplicated, and if it is, you can do a little something extra to make it unique. if that becomes a problem. And then also, we're doing something here which we are not creating a bib card. Very often when you're reading, in fact, most of the time when you're reading, you're going to be creating a bib card along with your reading. And that is a card that you're going to take notes onto, directly onto the card, and they'll go on the vertical side of the card as you read. When we're reading syntopically through the foundational book, we're pulling it in so intensively that we aren't as at risk for the two main problems of going straight from a book to main cards. There are two problems in going from a book to the main cards. One is going to be the tendency that you will have to make too darn many main cards, because you'll end up feeling that you got to capture the whole book. Well, if it's your foundational book, there really isn't too much harm in making too many main cards. And the other issue has to do with selectivity. If you are reading, I remember one book in particular, the author was an absolute wordsmith, and I captured one note, and then another note, and then another note, and then finally, he made his main point. Well, by the time I was done, I had 5 notes added to my box where one really would have done just fine. So that's kind of a selectivity is an issue that you is not, again, it's not a serious issue when you're dealing with your foundational book. Okay, so that's 2 important factors, the piece of view and the reference. Okay, the other thing that I wanted to point out as we went along was in the area where we specifically chose to start. We specifically chose to start working with the taxonomy of the character traits. And I chose that for a reason, in part because it's the most easily, where the organization is most easily visible, which enabled us to get our note card numbers very quickly. And the other reason is knowing the book I'm reaching for next, one of the early things it's going to be talking about is taxonomy. So that means I don't have to make quite so many cards before we have something that we can talk about. So that's just part of constructing an example where you get the feel for how to do the whole thing without actually sitting there and building a giant block of cards. Well, one of the things that I just wanted to point out, just to close tonight, is that we picked up the section when we were ready to do the taxonomy of the character traits. We started right back over here in the book where the taxonomy is most visibly broken down. But the reality is that there is some very important information about the taxonomy of the character traits earlier in the book on page 12 and 13. And so when we came to write our cards out about the character trait groups, we found that there wasn't really that much to say on that pretty colorful page. And that's because all that information is right here on these 2 pages. So we probably will come back and capture information from these pages. But it does present an interesting question, because these pages came about from an earlier section in the table of contents. Those pages came about from the character profile tool, not down here in the taxonomy. So how did information that belongs in the taxonomy end up in the character profile? And the answer to that is the chicken and egg problem that you have with writing a book like this. If I started out with all of the character traits, boom, 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 and didn't show you what you were going to use them for, that would make for a very boring and unapproachable book. So I wanted to start out with the fun part, which is, how do you use the character traits? How do they show up in your story? How do you build from them? And so in order to do that, you had to have some character traits. So that was why I took 2 pages to give you a handle on some character traits so that we could talk about how to build them in a story before we studied them in depth. So that's how that material got split off. But there's a simple way that we talk about material that got split off when we're building our cards. So I went ahead and built the card for section 3B on the character profile tool. As you remember from the table of contents, that was the second big group. That's how it got the number 4B. And in this section, you can see down here, there's a little note. It's in red. It's a square bracket and an arrow, and it tells you where you're going to find that information. So then that's where this information under the universal struggles, which is the character traits introduced early, I make a note that you'll find that back where it belongs, which makes a lot more sense when we're building our cards. Now, there's another thing that I want to point out that we did not do yesterday that we absolutely must do, and that is our indexing. So what you can see also on this card is a number of words have blue underlines. The title for this section, the character profile tool, obviously character profile and tool are all three key words. We're going to capture those. And the big theme of that page is about the triad of emotions. So when you get to that page in the book, that triad of emotions is a huge chunk. In fact, it's the whole title at the top of the book. So that is equally important to be in the index as the character profile tool. So you can put any number of keywords off of a card into the character profile tool. Okay, two more things to point out here. This first thing up here, you see the star? That star on a card always and only means there's something written on the back side. In this case, I drew the triad. Sometimes, very often for me, this will be a pointer maybe to something in my journal. Maybe the card just did not begin to capture what I was feeling. Like a whole almost essay was inspired by this card. Rather than trying to take out card after card after card and string them all together, I will put a reference to a spot in my journal and then write freely in the journal. And yet I still can get from one to the other. The other thing that you'll notice about this card, and it's the last piece for tonight, is over on this side here, it says 1 of 2. And I have a continuation card. And remember, I lop off the corners of my continuation card just so that they stack easily in my Zettelkasten, and I can immediately know that they go together. And what I did not have room for on this card was my personal reaction. Don't ever file a card into your Zettelkasten without your personal reaction, because the magic occurs when ideas bump into one another. And until it has your personal reaction, it's a factoid. As soon as you supply your personal reaction to it, it becomes an idea. It's not an idea until it's in your head. And that's how those words function. So this is just a priceless part of the value, the joy, and the energizing factor that you get out of a Zettelkasten. Because when two cards come together from two different purposes and they start filing together, and those disparate but slightly different but related ideas interact, you just get a surge of energy. Your mind just feels like it's grown. You feel like, whoa, my IQ just went up, because you're suddenly holding in your mind. You had a whole brain full of ideas, and now suddenly there's two brains full of ideas. You almost feel like your brain doubled in size because you're actually holding on to all of them. And then boom, a third idea pops out and you feel like your brain tripled in size. It's just a magical feeling, and it's very motivating. It's very energizing, and it's very insightful, because that's the whole reason you keep a Zettelkasten, is so that you can come across ideas that you would not come across otherwise. And syntopical reading with the Zettelkasten is the key way that you're going to make this happen. It doesn't work if it goes into the computer. It doesn't work if you type it in on your keyboard. It has to be handwritten. It has to be filed physically for any of the magic to take place. It's just, we haven't had computers very long in human history, but we've had a hand-brain connection since before we were fully human. So take advantage of it. Don't skimp on the time, because what you get out of it is so priceless that there's no amount of study time that can give you what a well-ordered Zettelkasten and the interaction of ideas can give you. So we'll continue our process of syntopical reading into a Zettelkasten tomorrow. See you then. Bye-bye.